You lost people this year? Maybe more than one? Maybe you can't even name a single person you'd call at 2 in the morning, and that fact sits in your chest like a stone you've stopped noticing you're carrying. Here's the promise of this video. The lack of friends in your life right now is not proof that something is broken in you. It is evidence of a shift happening underneath the surface, one most people never let themselves see. Picture this: you're scrolling through old photos, a birthday party, a group chat that used to buzz all day and now sits dead for weeks, and a small cold thought creeps in: what did I do wrong? Later in this video, I'm going to show you why the obvious fix, forcing yourself into more parties, more group chats, more putting yourself out there, backfires for most people who try it, and what actually works instead. But first, if this hits close to home, type "scene" in the comments. Just that. Let's begin. You wake up and the first thing you do is check your phone. Not for anyone in particular, just out of habit, that reflex hope that maybe someone thought of you overnight. Nothing. You scroll anyway. You watch other people's weekends, other people's dinners, other people's inside jokes playing out in comment sections you're not part of. And something in your stomach tightens just slightly, the way it does when you realize a door closed somewhere without you hearing it shut. You go through your day. You're polite to coworkers. You laugh at the right moments in meetings. You ask about someone's weekend and nod at the answer. And then you go home, and the apartment is quiet. And the quiet has a texture to it now heavier than it used to be, more aware of itself. This costs you more than you're willing to admit out loud. It costs you energy, because performing fine all day is its own kind of labor. It costs you self-respect, in the quiet moments when you wonder if you're likable at all, or just tolerable in small doses. It costs you time, the hours you spend replaying old conversations, wondering what you said wrong, wondering if anyone would notice if you disappeared for a week. And it costs you peace, because loneliness doesn't just visit at night. It sits next to you at lunch. It rides shotgun on your commute. It waits at the edge of every social event, tapping its foot, reminding you that you're watching more than participating. Think about the last time you saw a group photo pop up on your feed: a birthday, a bachelorette weekend, some inside joke frozen mid-laugh, and you weren't in it. Nobody sent you a cruel message. Nobody excluded you on purpose. It's quieter than that, and somehow worse for being quieter. You just weren't thought of, and the absence of malice doesn't soften the sting, it sharpens it, because there's no one to be angry at. You can't fight a vacuum, you can only sit in it, scrolling, doing the math on when exactly you stop being someone's first call. And it isn't only the big obvious losses, it's the small erosions that pile up without you noticing the total. The friend who used to text back within the hour now takes 3 days. The group chat that used to have 50 messages by noon now sits on read for a week at a time before anyone bothers. The plans that used to get made spontaneously now require weeks of scheduling, calendar links, let's find a time, as if seeing you has become a logistical project instead of a joy. None of it is a single wound, it's 1,000 paper cuts, and by the time you notice you're bleeding, you can't even point to the moment it started. Marcus Aurelius, writing to no one but himself in a war camp nearly 2,000 years ago, kept returning to one idea that most people skip past too quickly: that almost everything which disturbs us is not the event itself, but the judgment we've quietly attached to it. He wasn't talking about loneliness directly, but the principle lands here with brutal precision. The empty group chat is just an empty group chat. It's your mind that turns it into a verdict, a ruling on your worth, your likability, your place in the world. And once you see that the pain isn't coming from the silence, but from the story you've built around the silence, something starts to loosen. Not instantly, not painlessly, but it loosens. So let's name the actual idea at the center of everything we're about to unpack, because I don't want you sitting through the next 20 minutes waiting for a twist that never lands. Here it is plainly. The lack of friends in your life right now is not a measurement of your worth, it's a signal, it's information. It's your internal system telling you something true about where you've been, who you've outgrown, and who you haven't met yet. That's the whole idea. Everything after this is just peeling back the layers of what that actually means in practice. Let's be precise about what this does not mean, because I know exactly where your mind wants to take this. It does not mean isolation is a virtue. It does not mean you should retreat from people, build a wall and call it wisdom. Hermits who convince themselves they're above connection are not enlightened. They're often just scared, dressed up in philosophy. It also doesn't mean you did something wrong that needs punishing, or that you're fundamentally unlikable, or that this is permanent. This isn't a life sentence. It's a season, and seasons are really not suffered blindly. It also doesn't mean you should stop trying entirely, using this idea as an excuse to give up on people altogether. That's the trap on the other side of the road, mistaking this reframe as permission to disappear, to let every friendship lapse and call the resulting silence growth, when really it's just avoidance wearing a philosophy costume. There's a difference between a filter and a fortress. A filter lets the right people through while keeping out the ones who only wanted convenience. A fortress keeps everyone out, including the people who might have actually been good for you, and calls the resulting emptiness peace, because peace sounds better than fear. What we're building here is a filter, not a fortress. Keep that distinction close, because it's easy to slide from one into the other without noticing. And here's what it opposes, the thing our entire culture quietly rewards instead. We live in a world that treats a packed calendar as proof of worth. Story after story of brunches and group trips and squad photos, all functioning as a kind of social currency, as if connection can be measured in headcount. You're taught, without anyone ever saying it directly, that having many people around you means you're valuable, and having few means you're failing some invisible test. That belief is not wisdom, it's marketing. It sells events, apps, drinks, outfits. It does not sell you the truth, which is quieter and much less profitable. That 5 real people beat 50 performed ones every single time, and that the felt absence of a crowd is sometimes the first sign you've stopped settling for noise. This cultural script runs so deep that most people never question it directly, they just feel the pressure of it, and assume the pressure is coming from inside themselves. It isn't. It's coming from every feed you scroll, every highlight reel engineered to look effortless, every squad goals caption attached to a photo that took 40 takes to get right. You're not comparing your quiet Tuesday night to someone else's actual life. You're comparing it to someone else's best 5 seconds, curated and filtered, and losing that comparison every single time, because it was never a fair contest to begin with. Let's go section by section now, because this isn't one idea, it's 5 layers, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. The first and most accessible layer is this. The lack of friends means your tolerance for shallow connection is dropping. Think about the version of you from 5, 6, 7 years ago. That version could sit through a forced happy hour, laugh at jokes that weren't funny, talk about nothing for 2 hours, and walk away feeling fine, maybe even energized. Something in you has changed since then. Now you sit through the same kind of gathering, and you feel your patience thinning by the minute, watching the clock, calculating the socially acceptable moment to leave. That's not you becoming worse at people, that's your nervous system refusing to be fed empty calories anymore. Picture a work dinner. 6 people at a table, everyone talking over each other about vacation plans and office gossip, and you're nodding along, present in body only, while some quieter part of you is doing math. How long until this is over? How much longer do I have to hold this expression? You used to be able to do this without noticing the toll. Now you notice every second of it. Epictetus, a man who was born into slavery and still managed to build one of the sturdiest philosophies in human history, taught that we suffer most not from circumstances, but from clinging to things outside our control, and applause, company, being liked in the moment, all of that sits outside your control. What's inside your control is whether you keep feeding yourself connection that costs more than it gives. There's a real psychological mechanism at play here too, one you've probably felt without naming it: social comparison theory. It's the basic human tendency to measure our own worth against the people around us, especially in group settings where everyone is subtly performing their best selves. In a room of 6 people all trying to seem interesting, you end up measuring your value against 5 simultaneous performances, and performances are exhausting to watch, let alone compete with. Your growing intolerance for that isn't rudeness, it's your system recognizing a bad trade before your conscious mind catches up. Notice too how differently your body responds to real conversation versus performed conversation. Real conversation, even heavy real conversation, tends to leave you tired but full like a good workout. Performed conversation leaves you tired and empty, like you spent an hour running on a treadmill bolted to nothing. That distinction in how your body responds is data. Most people never learn to read it, so they keep mistaking one kind of exhaustion for the other, wondering why an evening with friends left them feeling worse instead of better. Here's the reframe. You're not becoming antisocial. You're becoming discerning, and discernment always feels like loss before it feels like relief, because it starts by subtracting before it adds anything back. The action for today is small but sharp. The next time you're in a shallow social exchange, notice the exact moment your energy starts leaking out, and just notice it. Don't fix it yet. Just clock it. Awareness always comes before change. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from small talk specifically, and it's worth naming, because most people mistake it for social anxiety when it's actually the opposite. It's social boredom wearing anxiety's clothes. Talking about the weather, about traffic, about what someone watched last night doesn't threaten you. It just costs you something with no return, like running a machine that produces nothing but heat. You used to be able to run that machine for hours. Now it burns you out in 20 minutes, and that's not a defect. That's a sign your capacity for depth has outgrown the shallow end of the pool you used to swim in comfortably. Let me ask you something before we move to the second layer. When was the last time you had a conversation that didn't feel like small talk with extra steps? Sit with that for a second, because the second layer builds directly on top of the first, and it's uncomfortable in a different way. The second layer is this. The lack of friends means you've stopped performing for approval, and the withdrawal from that performance is what's creating the silence around you. For years, maybe your whole life, a version of you existed specifically to be liked. That version laughed a beat too loud at things that weren't funny. That version agreed with opinions it privately disagreed with. That version shrank itself in rooms to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. And people liked that version, of course they did. It was built to be liked, but it wasn't fully you. And somewhere along the way, quietly, without a dramatic breaking point, you stop running that program. Someone makes a comment that used to get an automatic laugh out of you, an eye roll of agreement, a nod that cost you nothing. This time, you just don't. You stay quiet. Not out of spite, just out of a kind of internal refusal that surprised even you. And you watch in real time, the temperature of the room shift slightly, because the people around you were used to a performer, and the performer went home. Seneca warned his friend Lucilius, in letter after letter, that most people don't actually want your honesty, they want your agreement, dressed up as friendship. He wasn't being cynical, he was being accurate. A huge portion of the social bonds we build are built on mutual performance, an unspoken contract where everyone agrees to like the version of each other that requires the least friction. When you stop performing, some of those bonds simply can't hold weight anymore because they were never built to carry the real you in the first place. There's a concept here worth naming plainly: cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when our actions and our self-image don't match. For years, being easy to get along with was part of your identity. Now that identity is cracking, and the discomfort you feel isn't guilt. It's dissonance, the friction of becoming someone new while your old habits are still catching up. That discomfort is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's the exact sensation of growth, which almost never feels good in the moment it's happening. Here's the reframe, and I want you to actually hear this one. The people who drift away when you stop performing were never connected to you. They were connected to your performance. Losing that is not losing friendship, it's finally seeing what was and wasn't real. The action today is simple and slightly terrifying. In one conversation, say one true thing you would normally soften or swallow. Just one. Watch what happens. Watch who stays. Here's a question worth sitting with before we move on. How much of your current social circle exists because you actually chose them, versus how much exists because leaving would have required an uncomfortable conversation you never wanted to have? Most people never audit this. They let friendships run on autopilot for years, mistaking familiarity for compatibility, mistaking history for chemistry. The performer in you built a lot of those bonds. As the performer quiets down, some of those bonds are going to feel the strain first, before anything new arrives to replace them. That gap between the old performance ending and the new honesty being recognized is exactly where most people panic and start performing again. Don't. The gap is supposed to be uncomfortable. That's how you know it's real. We're a little past the halfway point of this video, and if you've made it this far, I want to say something directly to you. You already think differently than most people who clicked on this title, because most people bail the moment a video asks them to sit with something uncomfortable instead of handing them a 5-minute fix. So do me one favor before we go further. Hit like on this video right now, not because I'm asking you to check a box, but because it genuinely helps this reach someone else sitting in the same silence you are. And remember that thing I promised at the very beginning, why trying to fix loneliness the obvious way usually backfires? That's coming up next, and it's the part of this video that will probably sting the most. The third layer is heavier than the first two, so brace yourself slightly. The lack of friends means you are grieving people you've already outgrown, even if you haven't consciously said goodbye to them yet. This is the layer nobody warns you about, because grief is supposed to be reserved for death, for breakups, for dramatic endings. Nobody tells you that you can grieve a friendship that's still technically alive, still in your phone, still liking your posts occasionally, still technically your friend, while feeling, underneath all of it, that the person you needed them to be simply isn't there anymore. Imagine going through an old photo album, the kind you don't open often, and landing on a picture from years ago, you and a friend, arms around each other, both of you looking at the camera like nothing could ever come between you. You know now that things did. Not through some huge betrayal, no dramatic fight, no clean villain to blame, just distance, quietly accumulating, the way dust settles on furniture in a room you stopped entering. You still love who they were to you. You just don't know who they are to you now. And that unresolved space is its own kind of ache, one with no ritual to mark it, no funeral, no closure. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that everything is in a state of change, that clinging to a fixed version of anything, including people, guarantees suffering, because nothing stays fixed. Not you, not them. He wasn't trying to be cold about it. He was trying to be honest about the nature of things, because the honesty, once accepted, actually hurts less than the fighting against it does. There's a psychological frame worth naming here. Attachment theory. which tells us that humans form emotional bonds not just to specific people, but to the sense of safety and predictability those people once provided. When a friendship fades, you're not only losing the person, you're losing the version of stability they represented in your life at a particular time. That's why the grief feels disproportionate to what actually happened. Nothing dramatic happened. Everything happened slowly underneath the surface. This is also why closure so rarely comes from a conversation, even when you desperately want it to. You imagine that one honest talk would fix the ache, would let you both agree on what happened and part cleanly. But most fading friendships don't have a villain or a single decisive moment to point to in that conversation. They have years of small choices made by two people slowly prioritizing different things. And there's no tidy sentence that resolves years into a clean ending. The closure you're looking for outside yourself has to eventually be built inside yourself instead, because the other person may never be able to hand it to you the way you need it handed over. Here's the counterintuitive part. The swerve I want you to actually catch. You don't have to formally end a friendship to grieve its ending. You're allowed to mourn what it used to be while still being kind to what it is now, or gently letting it become nothing at all. The reframe is this. Grief here isn't a sign of failure. It's proof you loved something real, even if it wasn't permanent. And permanence was never actually the promise. The action for today is to write down privately one relationship you've been avoiding grieving because it never had a clean ending, and just let yourself name it as a loss instead of a mystery. You might notice, once you name it, that the grief comes with a strange companion guilt for having changed at all. As if growing past a friendship is a betrayal of the person you shared it with, rather than simply the natural outcome of two lives moving at different speeds. Seneca wrote to Lucilius that time is the one thing we're most careless with, spending it on people and habits we'd never spend money on if we saw the cost clearly. He wasn't telling him to abandon anyone. He was telling him to stop pretending that staying loyal to a memory is the same thing as staying loyal to a person. The friend you're grieving might still be a wonderful person. They just might not be your person anymore. And both of those things can be true without either of them being anyone's fault. The fourth layer moves us into more dangerous territory, because it's the layer that involves other people's intentions, not just your own emotions. The lack of friends means the people who would have used your loneliness against you can no longer find purchase on you. This one is uncomfortable to say out loud, but it's true. And I'd rather say the true thing than the comfortable one. Loneliness makes people exploitable. Not because lonely people are weak, but because desperation for connection, any connection, lowers your standards for who gets access to you. Think of someone in your past who only ever texted you when they needed something, a favor, an ear, a place to complain, and disappeared the second your own life needed tending to. You probably kept them around longer than you should have. Not because you were foolish, but because the alternative, total silence, felt scarier than being quietly used. That's not a character flaw. That's a basic survival calculation your nervous system was running without asking your permission. Epictetus drew a hard, unforgiving line between what is up to us and what is not, and the actions of other people, their loyalty or lack of it, their honesty or manipulation, all sit firmly outside your control. What is inside your control is the standard you allow, the threshold someone has to clear before they get real access to your time and your trust. As your tolerance for shallow connection drops, as you stop performing, as you sit with your grief, instead of running from it, something else happens quietly in the background. You become harder to manipulate, because manipulation depends on a hunger you no longer feel as desperately. The psychological term for part of this is the Ben Franklin effect. The strange but well-documented finding that we tend to like people more after doing them favors, not less, because our minds justify the effort after the fact. People who exploit loneliness understand this instinctively, even if they've never heard the term. They ask small favors first, building a false sense of investment and closeness, and lonely people hungry for any bond keep paying into an account that never pays them back. Think about a specific version of this: someone who only calls during a breakup, or a job loss, or some crisis that needs an audience and vanishes the moment your life is steady again. For years you might have called that person a friend because they showed up in the moments that mattered most dramatically. But showing up for a crisis is easy. It's exciting even. In a strange way, it gives the helper a role to play, a story to tell about themselves. What's rare, what actually separates real connection from performance, is someone who shows up on the ordinary Tuesday when nothing is wrong and nothing is happening, just because they wanted to hear your voice. Notice who does that for you. It's usually a much shorter list than the crisis list, and it's the far more honest one. The current silence around you, uncomfortable as it is also a kind of filter. The wrong people can't get through it anymore, because getting through it now requires more than convenience, it requires proof. The reframe, what feels like abandonment, might actually be protection, arriving in a form you don't recognize yet because you were taught to fear silence more than you were taught to fear the wrong company. The action for today: think of one person in your life who only shows up when they need something, and simply stop initiating contact with them for 1 week. Watch what that reveals. Here's the part that stings a little extra. Some of the people who drift when you raise your standards were never bad people. They were just people who benefited from your low threshold. The same way anyone benefits from a good deal without necessarily meaning you harm. That doesn't mean you owe them access. A door can close on someone without you needing to villainize them on the way out. You're not building a wall out of resentment. You're building a filter out of self-respect. And a filter, unlike a wall, still lets the right things through. Now for the final layer, the sharpest one, the one that ties everything else together. And this is where the open loop from the very beginning of this video finally pays off. Most people, once they feel this loneliness, do the obvious thing. They force themselves out. They download the apps, join the group, sign up for the class, say yes to every invitation, all in an attempt to flood the emptiness with numbers. And for most people, it backfires not because effort is wrong, but because desperate effort has a smell to it. And other people, even without knowing why, tend to pull back from it instinctively. Here is the paradox at the center of everything we've covered. The more urgently you chase connection, the more it slips away from you. And the more fully you become someone worth connecting to, the more it arrives without being chased at all. This is not mysticism, it's mechanics. When you show up hungry, visibly needing people to like you, needing the group chat to fill back up, needing proof that you're not as alone as you feel, you broadcast a kind of neediness that reads, even subconsciously, as a demand. People feel demands before they can name them, and they retreat from demands the same way they'd retreat from someone standing too close. But when you build the version of yourself we've been describing this entire video, discerning instead of desperate, honest instead of performing, grieving instead of denying, protected instead of exploitable, you stop broadcasting need. You start broadcasting stability. And stability, unlike desperation, is magnetic. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire adult life surrounded by people, senators, generals, and empires worth of company, and still wrote, in the privacy of his own journal, about the value of retreating into himself, because he understood something most people never learn, that the quality of your inner world determines the quality of what you eventually attract into your outer one. He wasn't isolated, he was rooted. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. So the twist is, this silence you're in right now is not the opposite of connection. It's the incubation period for the kind of connection that actually lasts. Most people can't tolerate the incubation period. They panic, they flood the emptiness with noise, they settle for anyone just to make the silence stop, and they end up right back where they started, surrounded by people but still fundamentally alone. You don't have to make that trade. The version of you being built in this silence, steadier, harder to fool, less hungry for approval, is the version other steady people are eventually drawn to. Not because you chase them, but because you finally stop needing to. Think about the people you actually admire. The ones whose company genuinely feels good to be in. Chances are, they are not the ones working hardest to be liked. They're not filling silences nervously or agreeing with everything you say to keep the peace. They're comfortable enough in themselves that they don't need your approval to feel steady. And paradoxically, that's exactly what makes you want to be around them more. You are learning right now in this uncomfortable silence to become that kind of person for someone else. Nobody hands you that. You build it alone in rooms nobody else can see, which is precisely why it can't be faked or rushed. There's a reason the desperate version of the search fails so consistently, and it isn't bad luck. When you approach people from a place of lack, I need this friendship to work, I can't afford to lose this connection, I have to make them like me. You make decisions from fear instead of discernment. You tolerate disrespect you shouldn't. You overextend yourself to secure approval that was never going to be stable in the first place because it was built on your desperation rather than mutual respect. Fear-based bonds are brittle. They look like friendship from a distance, but they collapse under the first real pressure because nothing about them was ever tested, only assumed, out of relief that anyone showed up. Contrast that with what happens when the bond is built the other way around, from sufficiency instead of scarcity. You're not choosing this person because the alternative is unbearable loneliness. You're choosing them because, even in your solitude, you were fine, and they simply made your fine into something better. That's an entirely different foundation. It can hold weight, it can survive disagreement, distance, long stretches of silence, because it was never propped up by fear to begin with. This is what the silence is actually building in you. Even on the nights it feels like it's building nothing at all. This is why the obvious fix, forcing yourself out, downloading the apps, saying yes to everything, backfires for so many people who try it without doing this inner work first. They skip straight to the search, still carrying the scarcity, still radiating the hunger, and they wonder why the search keeps returning the same shallow results. The search was never the missing piece. The person doing the searching was. Picture who you become on the other side of this. You walk into a room now, and you're not scanning for approval anymore, you're just present. You have one or two people, maybe three, who know the real version of you, the one that doesn't perform, and being known by them fills something that 50 acquaintances never could. You still have quiet nights, you still have moments where the apartment feels too still, but the stillness doesn't panic you the way it used to, because you've learned the difference between being alone and being abandoned, and you know now which one you actually are. Your phone still sits quiet sometimes, you still notice the group chats you're not part of, but you notice them the way you'd notice weather passing outside a window, real, present, and none of your business anymore. You answer text when you want to, not when panic demands it. You say no to plans that used to feel mandatory, and the world doesn't end. Somebody cancels on you, and instead of spiraling into what did I do wrong, you just make dinner for one and enjoy it, because your peace is no longer a hostage to other people's availability. When you do connect with someone now, it's slower, but it's real. You ask a second question instead of waiting for your turn to talk. You notice when someone's voice changes talking about their father, and you follow that thread instead of steering back to safer ground. People feel it. They can't always name what's different about talking to you, but they linger longer in conversations they used to end quickly, because you've become the kind of presence that doesn't need anything from them, and that, more than charm, more than charisma, is what actually draws people in. The world doesn't get less chaotic. People still drift, still disappoint, still leave sometimes without explanation. What's different is you no longer mistake noise for nourishment, and you no longer chase people who make you feel like you're auditioning for your own life. You attract instead of chase. You choose instead of settle. And on the nights the silence does return, you sit in it like someone who's made peace with a room, not someone trapped inside one. Here's your challenge, and I want you to actually do this, not just nod along and close the tab. For the next 7 days, stop initiating contact out of fear of being forgotten. Just for 7 days, notice who reaches toward you without being chased, and notice how much lighter you feel not performing for people who only show up when you beg them to. Write down what you notice. You'll be surprised. Some of you will finish this challenge and find the silence louder than ever. And that's not a failure of the exercise, that's the exercise working exactly as it should. It's showing you in plain terms exactly how much of your social world was built on your own initiation, your own effort, your own fear of being forgotten, doing all the labor of keeping bonds alive that the other side was never actually holding up. That's painful information. It's also the most useful information you'll get all year, because you can't fix a wall you don't know is leaning. Once you see it clearly, you get to decide deliberately who's worth rebuilding and who was only ever standing because you were holding them up. And for those of you who find the opposite, a text from someone you didn't expect, a call that came in unprompted, a friend who noticed the quiet and leaned into it instead of away, hold on to that. Write their name down somewhere you'll actually see it again. That's not a small thing. That's the beginning of the exact kind of connection this whole video has been pointing toward. The kind that doesn't need to be chased because it was never running from you in the first place. Remember this line because it's the whole video in one sentence. The lack of friends doesn't mean you're unworthy of connection. It means you finally stopped settling for the wrong version of it. If this landed for you, tell me in one word what season you're in right now. Grieving, filtering, building, waiting. Just drop it in the comments, because I read every one of them. And because typing it might be the first honest thing you say about this all week. And if you want more of this stoic thinking applied to the stuff nobody else is honest about, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Thank you for staying until the end. You're not as alone as the silence says.